It started as a small voice in the back of my mind, one I couldn't ignore. Suspicion is an insidious thing. It creeps into your thoughts, poisoning even the happiest moments. For years, I thought I had a perfect marriage. James was attentive, charming, and everything a woman could ask for. But lately, there had been little signs, subtle things that made me question everything. A text message he quickly swiped away. A late-night meeting that didn't feel right. The way he suddenly started taking more care with his appearance. I tried to dismiss it, told myself I was overthinking, but the doubt festered. Eventually, I couldn't bear the uncertainty. I needed to know. And that's when the idea came to me, as dark and desperate as the fear consuming me. I created her, a woman who didn't exist, a fake profile designed to lure out the truth. I used a stock photo of a stunning brunette with piercing green eyes and a smile that could melt glaciers. I gave her a name, Rachel, and crafted a life for her that was polished and alluring. Rachel was everything I thought a man like James would find irresistible. When I sent him the first message, my hands shook. It felt surreal, almost grotesque, to be typing words to my own husband under a false identity. "Hi, I came across your profile and couldn't resist reaching out. You seem really interesting." Smiley face. I didn't expect him to respond. I hoped he wouldn't. But within minutes, the notification chimed. "Hey, Rachel. Thanks for the message. You're not too bad yourself. What's a gorgeous woman like you doing messaging me?" The casual flirtation in his reply hit me like a punch to the gut. My husband, the man I'd built my life with, was engaging with a stranger. I told myself it was harmless, that maybe he didn't mean it, but his replies grew bolder with each passing day. Compliments about Rachel's beauty, playful banter, even a mention of how sometimes it's nice to connect with someone new. It felt like my world was crumbling. Each message was a dagger, twisting deeper and deeper. I hated myself for starting this, for setting the trap, but I couldn't stop. I needed to see how far he would go. One night, as Rachel, I asked him, "Don't you have a wife? Isn't she going to be upset if she finds out about this?" His response was chillingly nonchalant. "She's great, but we've been together forever. It's nice to feel wanted by someone new, you know?" I cried that night, alone in the dark, while James slept peacefully beside me.
How could he?
After everything we'd built together, after the love and trust one thought we shared. But then, something changed. I pushed further, asking him to meet up. To my shock, he agreed without hesitation.
"There's a little cafe downtown," he said.
"Tomorrow at 7? The following evening, my heart raced as I sat in that cafe, waiting. I felt sick, wondering if he'd show up. And then he did, walking in with that easy confidence I'd always admired. He looked around, a slight smirk on his face, and then he spotted me. For a moment, his expression faltered. Then, to my utter disbelief, he walked straight to my table and sat down. "Rachel," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or should I call you Emma?" I froze. My throat went dry. He knew. James leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? You've been acting suspicious for weeks. I saw you creating the profile. I watched you messaging me, waiting to see how far you'd go." His words were calm, but his eyes were sharp. My mind reeled. I felt exposed, humiliated. "Why didn't you say anything?" I stammered. He shrugged. "Because I wanted to see how much you really trusted me. Looks like I got my answer." Anger surged through me. "You played along. You flirted. You agreed to meet. How is that any better?" He leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "Emma, I played along because I needed you to understand something. Trust isn't just about loyalty. It's about believing in someone, even when you're scared.
You didn't come to me.
You didn't talk to me. You tested me like a stranger instead of trusting me like your husband." Tears burned in my eyes. "And what about what you said? About feeling wanted by someone new?" James sighed. "It was a line, Emma. Words I knew you wanted to hear, so you'd keep going. I wasn't talking to Rachel. I was talking to you, trying to show you how ridiculous this whole thing was." I didn't know whether to feel relief or rage. Part of me wanted to slap him for toying with my emotions, but another part of me realized he was right. I hadn't trusted him. I'd let my fear take over. I didn't know how else to get the truth. I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. James reached across the table, taking my hand. The truth is, I love you. I've always loved you. But if we don't talk to each other, if we let doubt and insecurity win, what's the point of any of it? The weight of his words settled over me, heavy but grounding.
He was right.
We both needed to do better. That night, we talked for hours, stripping away years of unspoken fears and frustrations. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like we were on the same team again. Creating Rachel had been a mistake, a desperate act born out of fear. But in a strange way, it forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage and start mending them. Trust isn't easy. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But as I looked at James, his hand in mine, I realized it was worth fighting for. Always. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the lingering discomfort from what had happened. Even though James and I had talked everything through, even though he had reassured me with words that felt genuine, there was a wound beneath the surface. Trust, once fractured, takes time to heal, and I wasn't sure if the damage we had inflicted on each other could be fully undone. The mornings were the hardest. James would kiss me goodbye before leaving for work, his lips brushing against my cheek like nothing had changed, but inside, I would hear echoes of his words from that cafe. Trust isn't just about loyalty. The statement was true, I knew that, but it didn't erase the ache of watching him flirt with Rachel, even if it had been a calculated act. It was like he'd turned my own game against me, and while I hated what I had done, I hated even more that he had been so willing to play along. Every night, I replayed our conversations, dissecting every detail, every moment where things might have gone differently. What if I hadn't created Rachel? What if I had just talked to James from the start? Would he have dismissed my insecurities? Or would he have given me the answers I needed without this elaborate charade? The questions circled endlessly, like vultures over the carcass of my pride. But life doesn't pause for self-reflection. Bills still needed to be paid, errands still needed to be run, and our friends still invited us to dinner parties where we laughed and joked like a picture-perfect couple. No one knew about the storm brewing beneath the surface, and we both seemed determined to keep it that way. One Friday evening, about 2 weeks after the incident, James came home with a bottle of wine and a look in his eyes that I hadn't seen in a long time. "Let's have a date night," he said, his voice light, almost playful. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to decline, to stay wrapped up in my cocoon of hurt and mistrust. But another part of me, the part that still loved him fiercely, wanted to accept. So I nodded, forcing a smile, and let him lead the way. We ordered takeout from our favorite Thai place and sat on the living room floor, the coffee table serving as an impromptu dining setup. James poured the wine, his movements deliberate, as though he were trying to set the tone for something meaningful. "Do you remember our first date?" he asked suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. I blinked, caught off guard. "Of course," I said. "You took me to that little Italian place downtown. The one with the terrible service, but amazing lasagna." He grinned. "And you spent the whole night trying to act like you weren't freezing because you thought the sweater you wore looked cute." I laughed despite myself. It was cute. Worth the frostbite. We fell into an easy rhythm then, reminiscing about the early days of our relationship. It felt good, natural, like we were reconnecting after being lost in a dark forest for too long. But even as I laughed, a tiny voice whispered in the back of my mind, reminding me that things weren't as simple as they used to be. Later that night, as we lay in bed, James turned to me, his expression serious. "Emma, I need to ask you something." My heart skipped a beat. "What is it? Do you regret it?" His eyes searched mine, his voice steady but tinged with vulnerability. "Making the profile.
Testing me.
Do you wish you hadn't done it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy and loaded. I thought about my answer carefully. Did I regret it? Yes, in some ways. It had been a betrayal of trust, a breach of the unspoken agreement between us to face things together. But at the same time, it had exposed something raw and real in our marriage, something we might never have confronted otherwise. I regret how I went about it, I said finally. But I don't regret wanting to understand what was happening between us. I don't regret wanting the truth. James nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. Fair enough. I guess I can't blame you for that. And what about you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you regret playing along? Pretending to be interested in Rachel? He exhaled deeply, as though he'd been waiting for the question. Honestly, I hated it. I hated seeing how much it hurt you, even though you didn't know I knew. But I also felt like I didn't have a choice. You needed to see how far you were willing to go just to confirm something that wasn't true. And I needed you to see what happens when trust breaks down. His words stung, but they also carried an uncomfortable truth. Trust wasn't something you could demand or manufacture. It was something you built together, brick by brick, moment by moment. And we had let ours crumble without even realizing it. The next few weeks were a slow process of rebuilding. We started being more intentional about our time together, setting aside our phones during dinner, and actually talking. James made an effort to be more transparent about his schedule, and I made a conscious choice to stop scrutinizing every little thing he did. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, but it was worth it. One night, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, James took my hand in his and said, "You know, this isn't something we're going to fix overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Are you?" I looked at him, at the man I had chosen to spend my life with, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. "I am," I said. "We'll get through this. Together." And for the first time, I truly believed it. As the weeks turned into months, life settled into a strange new rhythm. There was a cautiousness in our interactions now, a deliberate effort to tread lightly around each other's feelings. James became more attentive, not in a superficial way, but in the kind of way that spoke to a man who understood he needed to make amends. I found myself doing the same, watching my tone, choosing my words carefully. It wasn't just about avoiding conflict. It was about rebuilding the bridge we had so carelessly burned. But trust is a peculiar thing. You can try to piece it back together, smoothing over the cracks, but the memory of those cracks lingers. I would catch myself glancing at his phone when it buzzed, even though I promised myself I wouldn't. And James, for all his efforts, seemed to grow weary of the unspoken tension. He didn't say it outright, but there were moments I could see it in his eyes, frustration, a longing for the days when things weren't so complicated. One evening, I decided to take a bold step. After dinner, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat down across from him, and said, "We need to talk." James raised an eyebrow, setting aside the book he was reading. "That sounds ominous." "It's not," I said quickly, though my heart was pounding. "It's just, I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened, and I realized something." "Okay." He leaned forward, giving me his full attention.
I'm listening.
I took a deep breath. "I think part of why I created Rachel wasn't just because I didn't trust you. It's because I didn't trust myself." James frowned, clearly puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I let my insecurities take over. I doubted my ability to keep you interested, to make you happy. Instead of addressing that with you, I turned it into a test, like I needed proof that you weren't going to leave or cheat or whatever else I was scared of. But the truth is, I wasn't secure enough in myself to believe that you still wanted me." James stared at me for a long moment, his expression softening. "Emma," he said finally, "you're the only woman I've ever wanted. The only woman I'll ever want. But I can't convince you of that if you don't believe it yourself." "I know," I whispered, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I know that now. And I'm trying, I really am. I want us to be okay again." "We will be," he said firmly, reaching across the table to take my hand. "But you have to let yourself believe it. You have to trust me. Trust us." His words stayed with me long after we went to bed that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what it would take to truly trust him again. It wasn't just about him proving his loyalty. It was about me letting go of the fear that had been gripping me for so long. In the days that followed, I made a conscious effort to change my perspective. Instead of looking for signs that something was wrong, I started looking for signs that things were right. The way James would smile at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he'd remember little things, like how I took my coffee or my favorite song to play on a rainy day. These were the moments that reminded me of why I fell in love with him in the first place. One Saturday morning, as we were cleaning the house, James paused and said, "You know, I've been thinking about something too." I looked up from where I was dusting the bookshelf. "What's that?" "Maybe we need to get out of here for a bit. Take a trip, just the two of us. Somewhere new, where we can leave all this behind for a little while." The idea was tempting. We hadn't taken a proper vacation in years, always too busy with work or life to make the time. "Where would we go?"
I asked.
"Anywhere you want," he said with a grin. "As long as it's not here." A week later, we were boarding a plane to California. James had booked a cozy cabin near the coast, far enough from the city to feel like a true escape. The air was crisp and salty, the kind of air that makes you feel alive. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. We spent our days exploring the rocky beaches, hiking through redwood forests, and really talking. Without the distractions of everyday life, it felt like we were rediscovering each other, peeling back the layers of hurt and mistrust to find the love that had always been there. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to me and said, "You know, I think this is the happiest I've seen you in a long time." I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder. "It's the happiest I've felt in a long time." He wrapped his arm around me, pulling me close. Maybe we needed to break a little to realize how strong we really are.
His words struck a chord in me.
Maybe he was right. Maybe the cracks in our trust weren't just scars. They were proof that we had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. When we returned home, things weren't magically perfect, but they were better. We had found a new rhythm, one built on honesty and effort rather than fear and suspicion. I stopped looking at his phone when it buzzed, and he stopped feeling the need to explain his every move. Slowly but surely, we were rebuilding what we had lost. Looking back, I realized that the incident with Rachel had been a turning point, not just for our marriage, but for me as a person. It forced me to confront my insecurities, to see the ways I had let fear control me. And it taught me that trust isn't about perfection. It's about choosing to believe in someone, even when it's hard. James and I still have our moments, of course. No marriage is without its challenges. But now, when things get tough, we face them together. And that, I've learned, is what trust is truly about. Over the next year, life seemed to settle into something that resembled normalcy, though it wasn't quite the same as before. It was better in some ways, more fragile in others. James and I had found a balance, an unspoken agreement to be more open with each other. But every now and then, the past would creep in. A stray comment or an accidental glance at his phone would stir memories of that dark period, and I'd have to remind myself to breathe, to trust, to let it go. James, to his credit, was patient through it all. He never snapped or showed frustration when I hesitated. If anything, he went out of his way to reassure me. But there were moments when I saw something flicker in his expression, a hint of weariness, perhaps, or sadness. It was a reminder that trust wasn't just a struggle for me. It was something he was learning to navigate too. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch with a bowl of popcorn between us, James paused the movie we were watching. "Emma," he began, his tone soft but serious, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, turning to face him. "Do you ever think about what happened? About Rachel?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't like him to bring it up out of the blue. "Sometimes," I admitted after a moment. "Why?" "I've been thinking about it too," he said, leaning back against the couch. "Not in a bad way, necessarily. But I wonder if it left something unresolved. Like we moved past it, without fully dealing with what it meant." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart starting to race. James hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I mean, it wasn't just about you testing me. It was about both of us losing sight of what we had. I feel like we fixed the surface, but maybe there's more underneath that we haven't really addressed. I frowned, trying to process what he was saying. Do you think we're still broken? Not broken, he said quickly, reaching for my hand. Just maybe still healing. His words hit me harder than I expected. For months, I had been telling myself that we were fine, that we'd put everything behind us. But deep down, I knew he was right. There was still a wound there, a scar that hadn't fully formed. And pretending it wasn't there wasn't going to make it disappear.
What do we do about it?
I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. James gave my hand a gentle squeeze. I think we need to stop avoiding it. Stop pretending it didn't happen. Maybe talk about it more, even if it's uncomfortable. I nodded, though the idea of revisiting those painful memories made my stomach churn. Still, I knew he was right. Avoidance wasn't the same as resolution, and if we truly wanted to move forward, we had to face everything head-on. That night, we stayed up late, talking about everything, our fears, our insecurities, the ways we had hurt each other without realizing it. James admitted that he had felt neglected in the months leading up to the incident, that he'd started to wonder if I still found him exciting or interesting. I confessed that I had felt the same way, that I had let my own doubts and anxieties push me to a breaking point. It was painful to hear, but it was also liberating. For the first time, we were completely honest with each other, stripping away the layers of defensiveness and pride that had kept us from truly connecting. By the time we went to bed, the weight on my chest felt lighter, as if we had finally exhaled after holding our breath for too long. In the weeks that followed, something shifted between us. We started making time for each other in ways we hadn't before, impromptu date nights, long walks around the neighborhood, even just sitting together in silence without the distraction of phones or television. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic changes. It was about the little things, the moments that reminded us why we had fallen in love in the first place. One Saturday morning, as we were having coffee on the back porch, James looked at me with a smile that was both familiar and new. You know, he said, I feel like we're finally getting it right. Getting what right? I asked, tilting my head. Us, he said simply. I feel like we're finally in a place where we're not just surviving, we're growing. His words brought a lump to my throat. I think you're right, I said, reaching for his hand. We've come a long way. And we had. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of doubt, but we were learning to navigate them together. Trust wasn't something we could rebuild overnight, but with every step forward, it felt more solid, more real. As the months turned into years, the memory of Rachel became less of a painful reminder and more of a testament to how far we had come. It was a part of our story, but it didn't define us. What defined us was the work we had put into each other, the commitment we had made to grow and change together. Looking back, I realized that the experience had taught me something profound, not just about James, but about myself. It showed me the power of vulnerability, of admitting when you're scared or uncertain. It showed me that love isn't about never making mistakes. It's about being willing to face those mistakes together and come out stronger on the other side. James and I weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we didn't need to be. We had learned to trust each other again, to believe in the strength of what we had built. And that, I realized, was enough. As time went on, the pain of those earlier days became more like a distant echo than a constant ache. Life began to feel normal again, not the kind of normal that pretends nothing ever happened, but a deeper, more grounded normal. It was as if James and I had uncovered a version of our relationship that was quieter, steadier, and more intentional. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when the past crept in, uninvited, and I'd find myself wondering about the choices we had made, the things we had said to each other in anger or fear. But those moments became less frequent, and when they did come, they didn't linger as long. James was part of that healing, of course, but a lot of it was something I had to work on within myself. Trust wasn't just about him proving himself to me, it was about me proving to myself that I could let go of my fears. It was about choosing every day to believe in the man I married, in the life we had built together, even when the shadows of doubt tried to take hold. There were days when I felt proud of how far we'd come, like when James surprised me with tickets to a concert of a band we used to listen to when we first started dating. It was such a simple gesture, but it reminded me of the man who used to make mixtapes for me, who once spent an entire weekend driving across state lines just to take me to a beach I'd mentioned in passing. He hadn't changed, I realized.
He was still that same man.
It was me who had forgotten how to see him through that lens. And then there were other days when work was overwhelming, or when one of us said something careless in passing that felt harder. Trust isn't something you rebuild in a straight line. It's messy and uneven, full of progress and setbacks. On those harder days, I had to remind myself that healing wasn't about pretending everything was fine. It was about showing up anyway, about choosing love even when it felt fragile. One of those harder days came out of nowhere. I was cleaning the kitchen when James's phone buzzed on the counter. He wasn't home. He'd gone out to grab some groceries, and for a split second, the old urge to look at the screen came rushing back. I froze, staring at the device, as if it were some kind of test. The message could have been from anyone, a coworker, a friend, even the grocery store sending a notification, but the memories of Rachel, of the messages I had watched him send so easily, were still buried deep inside me. I stepped away from the counter, forcing myself to breathe. This wasn't about him, I reminded myself.
This was about me.
James had done nothing in months to suggest that he wasn't trustworthy. He had been open, honest, and consistent. The only thing standing in the way of that trust now was my own fear. When James came home a few minutes later, I told him what had happened. It wasn't easy. Admitting those kinds of vulnerabilities never is, but I knew I couldn't let those feelings fester. James listened quietly as I explained, and when I finished, he gave me a long, thoughtful look. "Emma," he said, setting down the grocery bags, "you didn't look. That's what matters. You're choosing to trust me, even when it's hard. And that means more to me than you know." His words hit me in a way I hadn't expected. I realized then that trust wasn't just about never having doubts. It was about what you did when those doubts arose. It was about choosing to lean into the love you've built instead of letting fear take over. And in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Over time, moments like that became rarer. The fear that had once gripped me so tightly began to loosen its hold. I started to feel like myself again. Not the paranoid, insecure version of me that had created Rachel, but the woman who had fallen in love with James all those years ago, who had believed in him so deeply that she'd said yes to forever without hesitation. We started making plans for the future again. For a while, our life had felt stuck in limbo, as if we were waiting for some invisible wound to heal before we could move forward. But now we were dreaming together again, talking about taking a big trip to Europe, about maybe buying a house outside the city, about the possibility of starting a family someday. These were the kinds of conversations that used to terrify me, because they required a level of vulnerability I hadn't been ready for. But now, they felt exciting, even hopeful. One evening, as we were sitting on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how close we came to losing this?" I looked at him, startled by the question. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't either. But I think it's important to remember. Not to punish ourselves, but to remind us how far we've come." I reached for his hand, intertwining my fingers with his. "I think about that too," I said. "And I think it's made us stronger." James smiled, squeezing my hand. "Stronger and a hell of a lot wiser." We sat there in silence for a while, watching as the sky turned shades of orange and pink. There was a quietness between us, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from things left unsaid. It was the kind of quiet that comes from knowing you've weathered the worst of the storm and come out on the other side. In the years that followed, our life wasn't perfect. No life ever is, but it was real. It was filled with laughter, arguments, makeups, and compromises. It was filled with small moments of joy, like cooking dinner together on a Tuesday night or dancing in the living room to an old song that came on the radio. And it was filled with love, the The kind of love that isn't always easy but is always worth it. Looking back, I sometimes marvel at how close we came to losing it all. If things had gone even slightly differently, if one of us had given up instead of fighting for what we had, our story might have ended very differently. But we didn't give up. We chose each other again and again, even when it was hard. And that, I realized, was the real lesson in all of it. Trust isn't about never making mistakes. It's about what you do afterward. It's about showing up, being honest, and choosing love even when it feels messy or uncertain. It's about believing in the possibility of something better, even when it feels out of reach. James and I weren't perfect, and we never would be. But we were enough. And in the end, that was all that really mattered. As the years passed, the events surrounding Rachel began to feel like a chapter from another life. James and I had weathered the storm, and while the memories of that time occasionally resurfaced, they no longer carried the same weight. Instead, they served as quiet reminders of how far we had come and how much we had grown, not just as a couple but as individuals. Life, in its steady and unpredictable way, moved forward. James got a promotion at work, something he had worked tirelessly toward for years. I started my own small business, a dream I had put on hold for too long out of fear that I wouldn't succeed. It was James, in fact, who pushed me to take the leap. "You're more capable than you give yourself credit for," he said one night as we sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by spreadsheets and scribbled notes. His belief in me was unwavering, and for the first time in a long time, I began to believe in myself too. With the success of my business came a newfound sense of independence. For so long, I had tied my sense of worth to our relationship, to being a good wife, a supportive partner. But now I was discovering a version of myself that felt whole and complete outside of that role. It wasn't that I loved James any less. If anything, I loved him more. But I no longer felt like I had to prove my worth to him, or to anyone else. It was liberating. James noticed the change in me almost immediately. "You're glowing," he said one evening as we shared a quiet dinner. "It's like you've found this new part of yourself." I smiled, touched by his words. "Maybe I have, but I think it was always there. I just needed to remember how to find it." Our relationship, too, evolved in ways I hadn't expected. The love we shared became less about grand gestures and more about the quiet, consistent ways we showed up for each other. It was in the way James would leave a cup of coffee on my desk in the mornings, knowing I'd need it before my first meeting. It was in the way I'd fold his favorite shirts, just the way he liked, or surprise him with a weekend trip when I noticed he was stressed. These small acts of care became the foundation of our connection, each one a brick in the house we were still building together. But life, as always, had its challenges. There were arguments, some small, some that left us both frustrated and exhausted. There were moments when the pressures of work and life threatened to pull us in opposite directions. And there were times when old fears tried to resurface, whispering doubts into the quiet spaces of my mind. But each time, we chose to face those challenges together. We had learned, through trial and error, that the only way forward was through honesty and vulnerability. And so, even when it was hard, we talked. We listened. We forgave. One particularly difficult season came when we decided to start trying for a family. It was something we had talked about for years but had always pushed off, waiting for the right time. When we finally felt ready, I imagined it would be a straightforward journey. But it wasn't. Months turned into years, and with each negative test, the weight of disappointment grew heavier. I blamed myself, convinced that my body was failing me. James, ever patient, reassured me time and time again that we were in this together. "It's not your fault, Emma," he said one night as I cried in his arms. "We'll figure this out. No matter what, we'll figure it out." His unwavering support was a lifeline during that time. And though the journey tested us in ways I hadn't anticipated, it also brought us closer. We learned to lean on each other in new ways, to find joy in the small victories, and to hold on to hope even when it felt distant. Eventually, after much soul-searching and countless conversations, we decided to explore adoption. It wasn't the path we had originally imagined, but it felt right for us. And when we brought home our daughter, a beautiful, wide-eyed baby girl named Clara. It was as if every struggle had led us to that moment. Parenthood brought a new kind of joy into our lives, and with it a new set of challenges. Sleepless nights, endless diapers, and the constant worry that we weren't doing enough became the new normal. But through it all, James and I leaned on each other. Watching him with Clara, seeing the way his face lit up when she giggled or reached for him, reminded me of why I had fallen in love with him in the first place. He was steady, kind, and full of a quiet strength that made me feel safe, even in the most uncertain moments. As Clara grew, so did we. Our lives became a tapestry of shared memories, family vacations, first steps, bedtime stories, and lazy Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and laughter. There were still challenges, of course, but they no longer felt insurmountable. We had learned to trust not just each other, but the strength of the life we had built together. One evening, years later, as we sat on the porch watching Clara chase fireflies in the yard, James turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if we hadn't gone through all that?" he asked. I knew immediately what he meant. Sometimes, I admitted. But I don't regret it. It was hard and it hurt, but I think it made us stronger. He nodded, his gaze following Clara as she laughed and twirled in the fading light. I think so too. It taught us how to fight for each other, how to choose each other. I reached for his hand, feeling the warmth of his palm against mine. "And I'd choose you again," I said softly. 100 times over. James smiled, leaning in to kiss my temple. "Me too, Emma. Every time." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft, golden glow, I felt a deep sense of peace. Our journey hadn't been perfect, but it had been ours. And as I sat there with the man I loved and the family we had created, I knew that every moment, the good, the bad, and everything in between, had been worth it. As the years rolled on, the seasons of our life shifted in quiet but meaningful ways. Clara grew from a curious toddler into a thoughtful, vibrant young girl who filled our home with laughter and questions about the world. James and I found a rhythm in parenthood, learning how to navigate the balance of being partners and parents. It wasn't always smooth. There were nights when exhaustion made us short with each other, mornings when miscommunication led to small arguments, but the foundation we had rebuilt after everything with Rachel remained strong. We had become experts in the art of recovery, in the practice of forgiveness and growth. The challenges we faced as parents were different from those we had faced as a couple, but they carried their own kind of weight. Clara was spirited and strong-willed, a child who questioned everything and refused to take no for an answer without a reason. I saw so much of myself in her, which filled me with pride but also tested my patience in ways I hadn't expected. James, on the other hand, had a way of calming her storms. When she threw a tantrum, he didn't raise his voice. He simply got down to her level, speaking to her with a quiet authority that somehow diffused even the most stubborn of her outbursts. Watching him with her reminded me of how he had been with me during our darkest moments, calm, steady, and unwavering. One evening, after Clara had gone to bed, James and I sat together in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine. The house was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. It was one of those rare moments when the chaos of life seemed to pause, giving us space to simply be together. Do you ever feel like we've become completely different people from who we were when we first got married? I asked, swirling the wine in my glass. James tilted his head, considering the question. In some ways, yeah. But in other ways, I think we're still the same. We've just grown into different versions of ourselves. I smiled at that. Different versions. I like that. He leaned back, his gaze softening as he looked at me. You know, Emma, there were times, especially back then, when I wasn't sure we'd make it. I didn't know if we'd ever find our way back to each other. I felt a pang of sadness at his words, even though they weren't new to me. I know, I said quietly. There were times I felt the same way. But we did, he said, his voice full of conviction. And I think it's because we never stopped trying, even when it was hard, even when it would have been easier to walk away. I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers with his. I'm glad we didn't. So am I, he said, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. Because this, our life, our family, it's everything I ever wanted. And it's because of you. His words stayed with me long after we finished the bottle of wine and went to bed. They echoed in my mind as I lay there, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing beside me. For all the pain and uncertainty we had faced, for all the times I had doubted myself and him and us, we had created something beautiful together. And in that moment, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not just for James, but for the journey that had brought us to where we were. As Clara grew older, our lives became busier, filled with school projects, soccer games, and weekend trips to the park. The years seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, each one bringing new milestones and memories. But no matter how hectic life became, James and I made a point to carve out time for each other. Sometimes it was as simple as cooking dinner together after Clara went to bed, sharing a dance in the kitchen to a song from our past. Other times it was a weekend getaway, just the two of us, where we could reconnect and remember what it felt like to be Emma and James, not just mom and dad. One such weekend, we found ourselves in a small cabin by a lake, miles away from the noise of everyday life. It was a place that felt untouched by time, with tall pines surrounding the water and a quiet stillness that seemed to settle into your bones. We spent the days hiking and the evenings sitting by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. On our last night there, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, James turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in years. "Do you ever think about how we met?" he asked, his voice low and thoughtful. "All the time," I said with a smile. "You were so cocky back then." He laughed, the sound rich and warm. "And you were so stubborn. I wasn't sure if you even liked me." "Oh, I didn't," I teased. "At least not at first." He shook his head, a playful grin on his face. "You were a challenge, but you were worth it." I leaned into him, resting my head on his shoulder. "So were you." We sat like that for a long time, the silence between us filled with the unspoken understanding that comes from years of shared history. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't fully articulated before. The strength of our relationship wasn't in its perfection, it was in its resilience. We had faced so much together, but we had never stopped choosing each other. And that, I knew, was what had kept us strong. When we returned home, life picked up where it had left off, but something about that weekend stayed with me. It was a reminder of how far we had come and how much we had to look forward to. And as the years continued to pass, as Clara grew into a young woman and we found ourselves navigating the challenges of parenthood and marriage and life, that reminder became an anchor, a quiet but constant reassurance that we were exactly where we were meant to be. James and I weren't perfect, and neither was our life. But it was real, and it was ours. And in the end, that was all that mattered. As time continued its unrelenting march forward, life unfolded in ways we could never have predicted. Clara went off to college, her departure marking the start of a quieter chapter for James and me. The house, once filled with the sounds of her laughter and footsteps, now seemed too large and too quiet. It was bittersweet. Pride mingled with the ache of missing her, but it was also an opportunity for us to rediscover who we were without the constant demands of parenting. We traveled more, revisiting places we'd loved and exploring new ones. James surprised me one spring with tickets to Paris, a city I'd always dreamed of seeing. We wandered its cobblestone streets hand in hand, marveling at the architecture, sharing long dinners at tiny cafes, and laughing like we had in the early days of our relationship. It felt like a second honeymoon, a celebration of the life we had built together and the love that had carried us through it all. Back home, our routines settled into something comfortable yet fulfilling. James took up woodworking, turning the garage into a workshop where he crafted furniture with meticulous care. I spent more time tending to my garden, finding peace in the simple act of planting and nurturing life. We found joy in these quiet pursuits, in the rhythm of days that were both ordinary and extraordinary in their simplicity. Every now and then we talk about the past, not in the heavy, painful way we once did, but with the perspective that comes with time and healing. The Rachel chapter, as we had come to call it, felt like a distant storm that had strengthened the foundation of our marriage rather than washing it away. It was a reminder of our resilience, of the love that had endured even when it was tested. One autumn evening, as we sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, watching the leaves fall in golden spirals, James turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said, "I think about everything we've been through, and I'm grateful for all of it. Even the hard parts." "Even Rachel?" I asked with a teasing smile, though my voice was soft with understanding. He chuckled, the sound warm and familiar. "Even Rachel, because without that, we might not have learned how to fight for each other the way we did." I reached for his hand, feeling the roughness of his palm against mine. "I'm grateful too. For you. For us." James leaned in, pressing a kiss to my temple. "I'd do it all again, Emma. Every bit of it." Tears welled in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the fullness of my heart. "So would I whispered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in hues of orange and pink, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Life, with all its twists and turns, had brought us here, to this moment, to this love that had stood the test of time. And as I sat there beside the man who had been my partner, my confidant, and my greatest champion, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. We were enough. We always had been. And we always would be.